Can everyone please settle down? We're about to start the next focus talk. Thank you. So, good morning again. I hope you all are having a wonderful time. Our next speaker is the brilliant Dr. Terry Regier. Dr. Regier is Professor of Linguistics and Cognitive Science and Director of the Cognitive Science program here at the University of California, Berkeley. Yay, go Bears! His research interest is at the intersection of language and thought with a focus on cross-cultural differences in cognition. Specific recent projects have included work on spatial language, kinship categories, color naming, word learning, and the poverty of the stimulus argument in language learning. He is an associate editor for the journal Cognitive Science and a member of the Spatial Intelligence and Learning Center. His talk today will be focused on how word meanings across languages reflect general communicative principles. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Terry Regier.
Is this on? Okay. Y'all hear me? Great. So good morning. Thanks for coming. It's a pleasure to be here. See if I can get this thing hooked up and we'll be all set to go. Good. So before I plow into my talk, I just wanted to say a couple of words about I'd like to start by saying thank you to CSSA, to the CogSci Students Association, for inviting me, but even more so for having this conference in the first place. So I guess before plowing in as a speaker, I wanted to just leave my CogSci program director's hat on for a couple of seconds and point out that this is sort of unusual. I know that at Berkeley it just sort of is taken for granted. Yes, I'm in cognitive science, therefore we have a conference, an undergraduate conference at the end of the year, because there's not much going on, what with finals and so on, so we thought we'd do a conference as well. And, I just want to point out, first off, this is wonderful, and second, it's a little unusual, so thank you all for your energy and your enthusiasm. It is very warmly appreciated. So much for that. Now to talk about what I have, basically some of my research. So I wanted to say a little bit about some of the work that we're doing in my lab here at Berkeley. And this is in collaboration with a bunch of other people. And so I'll just dive right in. I'm going to leave a little bit of time for Q&A at the end. And so if there are questions, you will see at certain points in my talk, I just sort of make these blanket claims without a shred of evidence, which is, scientific heresy, right? I can back them up, but I'm going to back up in Q&A instead of the talk itself. Other parts I will back up. So this is not going to be a totally, crazy unhinged talk, I hope. So let's plow in. The large question that motivates the work that I'd like to talk about today is whether word meanings, whether the concepts that are conveyed by words when you look across languages reflect a universal conceptual repertoire, a sort of psychic unity of humankind, or wide cultural variation. This is a question I've found engaging for a long time. It's one that has a fair amount of data that one can examine. And when you look at the data, I think it's fair to say at this point that the existing evidence concerning this question is mixed, or if you prefer, interestingly complicated, in that there's a fair amount of evidence for strong universal tendencies in the ways languages partition the world. And there's also a lot of evidence for cross-language variation. And so given that kind of empirically mixed picture, the challenge is to try to come up with a theoretically straightforward means of capturing this kind of double-headed empirical reality. And so what I'd like to do today is suggest such a theoretical means of grappling with these data. And if this all sounds a little abstract right now, don't worry about it. I'm basically giving you a sort of précis of my talk, and then I'll give you examples in just a second. The central claim I want to make today, and I'm going to try and support, is that systems of word meanings across languages tend strongly to support informative communication, and that straightforward, really simple idea accounts both for the universal tendencies that we see and for some fascinating cross-language variation. And I'll show you concrete examples of all that in a second. So that's basically my talk. You can go now. To flesh it out slightly, let me start with a sort of visual to convey the central idea. The central idea is extremely simple. If you were to imagine that you could take any communicative system, so any language on earth, English or Urdu or whatever, like some language, or hypothetical languages, so ways in which we could communicate, but it turns out we don't. You were to take any such communicative system and rate it for how well it supports communication, obviously what you get is some sort of distribution. Some would be terrible, quite a reasonable chunk of such communicative systems would be sort of, intermediate quality, and then there'd be the elite few, right? There'd be a few that are actually extremely good at this, extremely good at supporting communication. And the idea I want to pursue, it's a really simple idea, is that Mother Nature selects from the upper tail of that distribution. So, that, in some sense, should be an unsurprising idea. All I'm saying is that language is good at what it's for. And so that's a very unassuming claim. But what I think is interesting is that that really simple idea actually explains a whole lot of data. So, my central goal today will be to argue that that really simple idea does, I think, two really neat things for us. One is that it accommodates data from different semantic domains, different spheres of human experience that have traditionally been treated separately. And second, it explains within each of those domains a number of domain-specific generalizations that are there in the literature. And so the sort of bottom line of all of this, my large claim is that this idea gives us a level of generality and clarity not previously available. I'm going to try and back that up by examining three different domains, three different spheres of human experience that we talk about in language: color, spatial relations, and kinship. So I'll start with color, which is the domain in which these ideas, I guess, first sort of came into focus for me. This is work that I've been doing over the past few years with Paul Kay, who was previously at Berkeley, has now retired and is at ICSI, with Naveen Keterpal, who's a former grad student of mine at the University of Chicago, just got his PhD. A lot of what I'll be talking about today is his work. He's done a superb job. And also with Josh Abbott and Tom Griffiths more recently here at Berkeley. So, here you have a pretty standard color naming grid. This is often taken out to the field. This is the sort of stimulus set that's often taken out to the field to a speaker of one language or another. And people are asked, they're shown these individual colored chips, one at a time in random order, and asked, what would you call this in your language? What would you call this color? What would you call this color? And so on. You collect the data. This shows you such data collected from a particular language, Barinmo, spoken in Papua New Guinea. These are data collected by Debbie Roberson and colleagues. The extension of each colored blob, or rather the shape of each colored blob, shows you the extension of a named color category in this language. So this is a language that has a category that corresponds roughly to green or blue, right? The disjunction of green and blue. It's got a yellow term, a red, orange, pinkish sort of term, and so on. Okay? So that's the format of data we're going to be looking at. When you collect data like this from one language, you've just sort of got one set of data. When you do it across many languages, you start noticing things. And one thing you notice is patterns like this. You'll start noticing that languages spoken on opposite sides of the planet have actually quite similar color naming systems. This is something that's been known for a while. I think it's interesting to see the data. So here you have languages spoken in Papua New Guinea, but also Bolivia and Honduras with actually rather similar color naming systems. So this suggests something like what I referred to earlier, this notion of a psychic unity of humankind, some sort of underlying universal base, such that even though we speak different languages, perhaps we perceive and conceive of the world in very similar ways. So that's a very influential idea, one that's been out there for a long time, and recently a number of people have been arguing it is completely incorrect. And one reason they've been arguing it is completely incorrect is that this is only half of the data. The other half, so to speak, of the data look quite different. They look more like this. And I have to say that when I first got involved in this stuff, my expectation was that the world was going to look a lot like this. There were going to be strong universal tendencies, and there are. This is correct. But this is also correct. if you look across languages, the amount of cross-language variation in color naming is much greater than I thought it was going to be. And so this is the kind of empirically mixed picture that we have. And the challenge, as I've suggested, is to somehow grapple with both halves of this picture in a simple, clean way. And so to that end, having made my slightly abstract intro hopefully a little more concrete by grounding it in a specific domain, let me give you sort of exactly what I want to propose is going on here. This is the notion of informative communication. Let's say you've got a speaker, and this person sees some color and would like to communicate that experience to some listener. The listener can't see the color, and so the speaker sort of helps out and says, well, you know, it's red. So if that is going to be something that actually communicates something to the listener, what we need, what the listener's job is, in some sense, is to mentally reconstruct what that thing must have been based on what the speaker said. Right? So there's an active mental reconstruction going on in the process of understanding what someone has to say. And the core idea here, which is really simple, is that words, if they're going to be good, if they're going to support communication well, words should have meanings that allow accurate mental reconstruction by the listener of what the speaker had in mind. Really straightforward idea. That I've illustrated in the case of color, but it holds across domains. We could be talking about airplane design, we could be talking about dinosaurs, or we could be talking about color or kinship or space. But to take this idea and sort of project it down onto a specific domain, namely color, one needs to know a little bit about that domain. And so the background here, I think that the sort of the core thing to keep in mind about color, and then I'll give you similar sort of teaser kind of domain snapshots for the other domains I talk about, is that perceptual color space is irregularly shaped. You don't see that irregularity on this 2D grid. It seems that hue varies evenly here and lightness varies evenly here, but that obscures the third dimension of color, which is saturation, or how ungray a particular color can get. And that actually varies unevenly across this grid. So that underlyingly, psychologically, color space is three-dimensional and irregularly shaped. I can come back to details of this if people are interested, but the fact that it is irregularly shaped has consequences. The consequences are that some partitions of that space into categories are going to be more informative than others. That's an idea that goes back to Jameson and D'Andrade from 1997. They put this idea out there. They didn't actually test it. They didn't formalize it, and they didn't test it. And I was a little surprised by that, because I thought, this is a kind of cool idea. I mean, it's an idea that potentially has legs. So let's see how far it goes. So in, I guess, 2007, some collaborators and I thought we would take this idea, which hadn't had a lot of attention. We thought it deserved more. And we set about trying to test it. We took a system of color categories to support accurate mental reconstruction, going back to that little communicative scenario I showed you, to the extent that that system groups similar colors together. Because if you say red, and I conjure up a sort of set of possible colors, to the extent that those are close to what you had in mind, they're all similar to what you had in mind, to that extent I have understood you reasonably well. We formalized that, as you see here. There are other formalizations. They pretty much, within reason, more or less give similar results. Essentially, we took the similarity of two colors to be effectively a Gaussian function of distance in a standard perceptual color space. We measured overall within category similarity, overall cross-category contrast, and took the well-formedness, or basically the informativeness, of a system to be the sum of those two. So that's our formalization of the kind of general idea that I sketched for you. And our general prediction then was that natural color naming systems, the ones that we actually see in the world's languages, should be near maximal in this value W. So as I sketched before, we're suggesting Mother Nature selects from the upper tail of that distribution. So how can we test that? What we did was create theoretically optimal color naming systems for 3, 4, 5, 6 terms. So we began assuming a totally random assignment of categories to each individual chip in this grid, and then did steepest ascent in well-formedness to arrive at the theoretically optimal way of naming color. So if you have 3 terms, our account says this is how they should be divided up into categories. So the question is, does this match actual languages? And the answer is it does tolerably well. Not perfectly, but reasonably well. It certainly captures the idea that there's a composite red-yellow term, that there's a black-green-blue term, in both the model and in reality. So that's at least initially reassuring. We also have a reasonable fit, not perfect, but reasonable for 4 categories. There's model, there's 1 language. For 5, this is the theoretical optimum, and there are actually many languages that look like this. This, for whatever reason, happens to be an extremely popular, at least in our data set, means of carving up color space. And for 6, again, you have a reasonable match to the data. So this is suggesting that at least some languages, these, I will be open about this, these were admittedly cherry-picked. But there exist languages out there, out of a set of 110, that rather closely match the theoretically optimal way of partitioning color space. So, one thing I think is kind of fun about this, remember I'd made the claim that we cannot just talk about these, we cannot just explain particular languages, but we can explain domain generalizations about the domain. And people have been studying this stuff for quite a while. And so going back to 1969, when I was a very young boy, and many of you weren't yet, it's been known that color terms in the world's languages appear in a specific order. That if a language has 2 terms, they'll be basically white and black. If there's a third, it'll be red. If there's a fourth, it'll be either green or yellow, and so forth. This is the work of Berlin and Kay back in '69. And what I think is sort of fun is that order is explained by this notion of informative communication. Here's a 2-term language, it's basically black and white, third has red, the other one has yellow, and so on. So that it sort of falls out of more general principles, is the suggestion. But remember I told you there's 2 halves of the story, the sort of universal half and the variation half. Well, the variation half is equally real. Many languages don't fit these theoretically optimal templates at all. I mean, they don't even look that close, right? So a natural question then is, are these systems nearly optimal? Are they maybe not right where you might predict, but they're like really good instead of, they're sort of A- rather than A material, right? So something like that. Basically, the answer is yes. And I'm not going to tell you why I think that. Instead, if you're interested, I'll give you our URL at the end. Go check it out. Come talk to me later. I don't think there's time to go into the details. But basically, we have a set of analyses that suggest that not only do we have languages that partition color space pretty much exactly as they should, the ones that don't get quite close to that. They find alternate routes to talking about color that are almost as good as the top-ranked ones. So, interim conclusions. I've gone into some detail on this domain because I wanted to give you a sense for the overall framework. But the interim conclusions are that it looks like universals and variation, the 2 empirical halves of that story, in color naming across languages are explained by the principle of informative communication. And second, that same principle also explains existing descriptive generalizations. So, I'll leave that right there for now and move on to the second of my 2 domains, spatial relations, which is something I've been doing a lot of work on recently. I am not going to go into much detail on space. I just want to give you a sense for the data, a sense for how the data look sort of, generally similar to what you saw in the case of color, but I want to leave time for kinship. So I'll be brief here. This is work, again, with Naveen Keterpal, my recently graduated grad student at Chicago, and with Asfa Majid at the Max Planck Institute for Psycholinguistics in Nijmegen in Holland. I want to give you a feel, just to start with, for how the data are similar to the data for color. So here what you see is 4 spatial scenes, and they all fall in the same category in English. We would say the apple is in the bowl, the dog is in the what would we say the dog is in? Whatever it is, it's in, right? Like the basket. The fish is in the bowl, and the box is in the bag. So these are all in English, and as it happens, they all fall in the same category in Basque, Dutch, and Yélénien, which is a language spoken on a small island off Papua New Guinea. So this seems like evidence for universals. At the same time, consider these 4 scenes. These all fall in the same category in English. The letters are on the shirt, the strap is on the bag, the coat is on the hook, and the book is on the shelf. However, they fall in 2 different categories in Dutch, and in 3 different categories that cross-cut the Dutch ones in Yélénien. So, again, we have this empirically mixed pictures of universals on the one hand, and really kind of interesting cross-language variation on the other. Those are both real. We want to be able to account for both of them. Just to give you a sense for the cross-language variation, this is a very cluttered slide, and it won't be on the final, don't worry. But just to give you a sense for sort of how much variation there is, this is a grid of spatial relations, stimuli showing spatial relations, carved up, partitioned according to the spatial system of one language, and then I'm going to show you the same grid relative to 2 other languages. So here's another one, and there's another one. So as you can tell, just superficially and quickly, the variation is substantial. So the natural question is, having seen this sort of interesting mixture of universals and variation in space, as we did in color, do spatial naming systems support near optimally informative communication just the way color systems do? The answer is yes. And again, I'm not going to show you the analyses now because I want to leave time for other stuff, but I'm happy to take questions during Q&A. So, having dealt perhaps a little too dismissively with the second of my 2 domains, let's move on to kinship. This is work that I've been engaged in recently with Charles Kemp at CMU, at Carnegie Mellon. It was recently published, just last year, in Science. And it basically is sort of a development of the same ideas. A group of us are working right now on taking all of this and making sure, and it turns out the answer is yes, that with a single set of equations, a single formalization that's very straightforward, all the results in all the different domains we've looked at so far work out. Imagine you have a woman named Alice. Alice has a daughter and a son and a daughter's daughter and a daughter's son and so on. She's got a mom and a dad and the rest of a family tree. So there she is. There's Alice with her family tree. What I'll show you next is that family tree color-coded according to the kinship categories of English. So you may not be used to seeing your language portrayed this way, but you'll notice that, for example, the mother's mother is color-coded the same as the father's mother because there's a single word, namely grandmother, that refers to both relatives. Similarly, the younger sister has the same color as older sister because in English, although not all other languages, those receive the same kinship category, namely sister, and so on. So my hope is that if you stare at this long enough, you'll be able to convince yourself, yes, that's English. To give you a sense for the variation across languages, I want to share with you what I think is actually a very interesting system. This is from Northern Paiute, which is an American Indian language. It's actually spoken just north of here, sort of California, Nevada region, which is, let's just say, different. So, and I think a kind of illuminating way. So you'll notice that we no longer have the same word grandmother used for the maternal and paternal grandmother. Those are 2 different categories. We no longer have the same word used for younger sister and older sister. We have different expressions used. But I think the most interesting thing in this language, or at least one very interesting thing, is that the word for maternal grandmother, the word that Alice uses for her maternal grandmother, is she'll also use for her daughter's son and her daughter's daughter. Now that seems a little counterintuitive at first, but what I think is fun about this is that it actually makes sense. The reason it makes sense is that Alice, of course, refers to this person as her maternal grandmother because that's who she is. These kids refer to Alice as their maternal grandmother because that's who she is, and so she just flips the word around and uses it for them. So it's reciprocal. Right? So what you have is a sort of reciprocal maternal grandmother category. Now what I like about this example is that we don't talk this way in English, but it makes total sense. Right? Simultaneously. It's completely, if you've never seen this before, it's like really not the way we do things, and at the same time you can kind of say, well, there's a logic to it. There's a grammar out there, right? There's a sort of systematicity to it. So why do we see this sort of pattern? Why do we see, when we look across languages, we get a huge amount of variation in kinship naming systems? This is actually a domain that's been studied in great detail, and the variation is fascinating. This is just a sort of taste. So the natural question is whether we can account for it in similar terms to the ones we've used for color and space. So the specific hypothesis I want to pursue here is that kinship systems in the world's languages achieve a near-optimal trade-off between 2 opposing forces. Simplicity, which I haven't talked about yet, but is actually relevant to color and space as well, and our old friend, informativeness. So that's that's my hypothesis, that's my claim, and I'd like to test it. So to do that, to test that, to give teeth to this claim, I'm going to need definitions of simplicity, of informativeness, and by whatever it is that I mean, by a near optimal trade-off between the two. So I'll do that, I'll run through those, present results, and then wrap up. So to start with, simplicity. Any kinship system can be defined in terms of a set of rules that are composed of semantic primitives. So here's a set of semantic primitives that we chose to use, not arbitrarily, these are widely used in the literature, and a set of means of combining primitives into larger structures. Again, drawn from the literature, fairly standard, reasonably standard stuff. And we then took the complexity of a kinship system to be the minimum number of rules needed to define it. So here's English again, with its simplest definition. That's what mother means, right? Parent and female. It contains 12 rules, so the complexity of the system is 12. In contrast, this is Northern Paiute, the simplest definition for it. It's longer, it contains 22 rules, so the complexity is 22. Northern Paiute, as it happens, is both more complex and more informative than English. So how do we flesh out the notion of informativeness in this case? It's going to look a little different, but I assure you underlyingly the concepts and eventually the sort of formalization as well is the same. We're going to start with the observation, which is actually a sort of important one, that there's greater need to refer to some individuals than others. And we then took the need probability, P sub I, for referring to relative I. We estimated that by corpus counts for kinship terms in English and German. Terms like my mother, or my mom, or whatever. And then what we found was this distribution of, bless you, of need probabilities over the various relatives in our standard family tree. So it's not uniform, right? For certain relatives get referred to more than others. Fine. Consider, if you would, this wonderful lady whom I remember very fondly. This is actually my maternal grandmother, here holding up adoringly my then younger brother. If I wanted to refer to her in English, I'd call her my grandmother. And that expression is okay as far as it goes, but it is, of course, it carries some cost in that grandmother could mean either mom's mom or dad's mom. And so I need one additional bit of information to zero in on which of my two grandmothers I'm actually referring to, namely her. So we took the communicative cost of referring to some relative, like her, as the additional information beyond the kinship category, beyond grandmother, needed to identify that particular individual or that particular relative. And we formalized that using a very standard information theoretic notion, surprisal. So effectively, how surprised should you be to find out that it was this one rather than that one, given the array of options available? And the communicative cost for the system as a whole is the weighted average of the communicative cost for each of the individuals. Very, very simple notion. So I've defined complexity for you. I've defined informativeness, or communicative cost. What I'd like to show you, we can now plot them in a 2D grid, and what I'd like to show you next is the space of possibilities. So we generated, before looking at actual data, we asked what are the possible kinship systems that one could generate out of the semantic primitives and the rules that we have. So essentially generate them at random and see what is out there. And that is shown here. So that gray space is the set of possible it represents the set of possible kinship systems, or a large subsample from the set of possible kinship systems. Now, if our hypothesis is right, and what we're looking at in real languages is the optimal trade-off between simplicity, anti-complexity, and informativeness, which is anti-communicative cost, we're going to expect actual languages to show up somewhere along the optimal frontier. Low complexity and low cost, right? So they should be somewhere around there. Ideally, they should be like right there, but that's to say maximally low complexity and maximally low cost. And when we look across languages, what we find is more or less that. So this is a set of 487 languages taken from work by Murdoch. So in all this work, we're definitely relying on decades of work by others who collected the data. This is, analyzing the data. So the fact that these languages do cluster in the predicted part of space seems like support for this notion that they're trading off simplicity and complexity. I'll leave aside some of the other analyses we did. I wanted to flag that, as in color, I had said that we could explain known constraints. That's true here again. So one thing which has been known for a while is that across languages, in kinship terms and actually other terms as well, the conjunctive categories defined in terms of a logical conjunction, those are more common than disjunctive categories. So for example, the idea of parent and female, is quite common across languages, whereas parent or female is not. In English, this sort of makes sense because parent and female is referred to as mother, whereas parent or female means something that I find it hard to express, and for that matter, not entirely easy to think of. Someone has said this is the person. I don't quite know what that would be, but it's sort of not as cleanly, distinctly formed an idea as like mom, who's quite distinctly formed. This makes sense on the idea we've been pursuing here, because this conjunctive category is the intersection of two things, and therefore it's using representational resources to narrow down the set of things we might be talking about, whereas the disjunction does the opposite. So a conjunction is more informative, therefore it has lower communicative cost, therefore it is preferred on this system, and in that sense we're explaining this known constraint. Let me give you another one just to wrap up quickly. It's been known for quite some time that near relatives, like siblings, you tend to get more semantic distinctions made among near relatives than among distant relatives. So, for example, more semantic distinctions among siblings than, let's say, maternal siblings. That makes sense because if you look at the numbers, we tend to refer to our siblings much more than our maternal siblings. And returning back to our cost term, that's weighted by how often you refer to things. Therefore, if you have a large, sort of vague, nebulous, and therefore high cost category, but you're using it in a very, infrequently referred to part of space, that's maybe okay, compared to using it and bearing that cost in a heavily trafficked part of space. And so this observation falls out of the way we've been talking about this. The same is true for comparing ascending generations like grandparents to descending generations. Again, you get this frequency disparity, and again, that observation falls out of this. So basically what I want to argue is that kinship systems in the world languages do achieve a near optimal trade-off between simplicity and informativeness. And pulling back and talking about everything I've covered today, basically what I'd like to conclude is that this idea of informative communication, and for that matter, its trade-off with simplicity, this seems to operate as a kind of general structuring principle that operates across semantic domains. So we need not think of these things differently. And what I personally have found really kind of fun about this work and energizing is that if it's truly general, that means I ought to be able to explain other aspects, other semantic domains in the same terms. And that's something we're pursuing right now. I want to see how far this generalizes. We also have an account, I think, for a sort of interplay between universal structure and culturally varying linguistic convention. So the two empirical halves, right, the universal and the variation, do fall together and do have a single, I think, unified explanation in terms of very general principles concerning like how we talk with each other and what it is to communicate an idea from one mind to another. And as I've mentioned, it explains a number of domain-specific constraints. So that's basically what I wanted to convey today. I think, just to say a couple of points to wrap up before moving to Q&A, because I deliberately, as you saw, sort of ripped out some of the specifics so that people could ask about them, or if you want to ask something else, that's totally fine, like whatever. But I wanted to end this with, I didn't quite know what to call this. This isn't conclusions exactly. It's more a perspective on this work. I like to think of this work, and one reason I've found it enjoyable is that it seems to me that it bridges two communities that that historically haven't interacted very much and continue to sort of rarely interact, but really have a lot to learn from each other. And those are, on the one hand, computational cognitive science, and on the other, linguistic fieldwork on endangered or underdocumented languages. So the theoretical ideas that I've brought to bear on the data here today are from computational cognitive science, and I do feel that there are theoretical riches to be had there. The data that I've looked at are from linguistic fieldwork, often on endangered or underdocumented languages. And it's really important to go for these underdocumented languages because languages really are very different. And if you only go for, sort of the well-documented ones, the chances are excellent that you're going to be missing important information. So theoretical riches here, empirical riches here, to my mind, it's a very natural combination. So I will end with that. I'd like to acknowledge support by NSF, in part through the Spatial Intelligence and Learning Center. I'd like to again thank my collaborators on all this work. Thank again CSSA, as I did in opening, for making this all possible. And I'd also, of course, like to thank you all for your attention. And if anyone would like to sort of find out more about all this, please visit our website, the Language and Cognition Lab, lclab.berkeley.edu. Thank you. How are we time-wise? Great. So, any questions? Sure. English has more than any of the ones I showed you. That's for sure. English is fairly typical of languages of industrialized societies with respect to color naming. And one worry that people have had is that industrialization is sort of like a culture itself, right? So by the time you're trading objects back and forth, and you're building things and trying to ship them to China or from China or whatever, it's like you all more or less have the same set of cultural expectations, and therefore you're all going to have to traffic in the same set of categories. And so a worry has been that when you compare English with, let's say, French, it's not that different, right? Spanish, it's not that different. There are some differences. Russian and a number of languages in that part of the world make a distinction between light blue and dark blue that we don't in English, for example. So there is that difference. But in general, a lot of this work has sought to go beyond languages of industrialized societies for the reasons that I mentioned, right? You want to make sure that you're not in some kind of culturally constrained groove where there's sort of all sorts of fascinating variation that you don't see. But yeah, it is certainly the case that English is more informative and more complex, less simple than some of these other languages. That's totally true. Sure. Yeah.
Are there any domains or any categories that, I don't know, you would think this does not apply to because they're on either extreme?
I'm sorry, I don't...
That they are mostly always universal or always varying, I guess, because of cultural factors. Are there any such domains that you would consider?
Domains in which I would expect?
I guess like colors, kinship categories, kinship.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think given we've examined 3 domains so far, so I can't. Beyond this is just rank speculation. Well, not total. I mean, I've read, but I haven't done analyses. My expectation would be that you're going to see these same 2 principles in action more or less analogously across domains. That's at least a sort of null hypothesis. It's it's the hypothesis we go into this with. It could be wrong. I'm open to that. It's happened before. And it may happen again. But that would be the expectation. Having said that, I do want to add. I mean, I think one thing that perhaps is relevant is that there's sort of an expectation that if you're looking at a domain which is, let me say a couple of things about the domains I have looked at and how they might fit in a larger picture. So one thing about color is that it is continuous and it is very much in your face. It's not something you have to think about. It's just sort of right there. One thing about kinship is that it's discrete and it's very abstract. You can't tell looking at my mom that she's my mom. Well, you can a little bit, but for the most part, you certainly can't tell looking at like my grandfather. Right, so I mean, these are things that you have to know. It's conceptual. It's not just sort of brutally perceptual. So these are pretty different kinds of domains, both with respect to continuousness versus discreteness, and with respect to perceptual versus conceptual. My general expectation, which seems to be borne out so far, is that you may be seeing more variation and sort of more flexibility in some sense, the more abstract, the more conceptual the domain, because there's, in some sense, more wiggle room. Color is a three-dimensional space. It's amazing that we get as much variation as we do out of what is, at bottom, a lumpy solid in 3D space. There's not that much to it. Kinship is much more complex. Other domains, again, are going to be much more complex. But again, I'm going to expect sort of the same general principles to apply until proven incorrect. Other questions? Sure.
Well, yeah, referring like to the fieldwork aspect of it.
Yes.
We attempted to sort of integrate things about the culture itself into the model. I'm thinking in here like about colors that in cultures where they don't have artificially created objects, they don't really have things that are blue, and that's maybe why blue is the last color to show up.
Yeah, so I think in a word, yes, that is something we're just beginning to do, and I think it's actually really fascinating. So one thing I didn't go into much detail on, but is very relevant, is that I've sort of been assuming that there's sort of a one-size-fits-all feel to this stuff, and that's just wrong. And I think one place where you see that being wrong in a way that I think we can handle, it has to do with how often people refer to particular things. So how often, let's say, blue gets referred to, or how often distant members of the family get referred to if you're in a society which is largely organized around a nuclear family as opposed to a more extended family, right? So those, we're using German and English corpus counts on our kinship stuff, and we're trying to account for languages from all over the world on that basis. That is an assumption that gives us some purchase on the data, but it's wrong in detail. And so the kinds of analyses we have in mind to test exactly the idea that you're talking about in more detail would be like, get the real numbers. Now, getting corpus counts on all of these languages is sort of not really doable, but you can find proxies for them that are probably better than assuming that they're just like English. And doing that, the expectation would be that if you've got such a language, language X in our data set that is not English, and you substitute in for the corpus counts that we've used some sort of measure that's linked more directly to communicative practices in that society, the prediction is it should move closer to the optimal frontier. That would be the prediction. Maybe it's true, maybe it's not true, but that's the prediction. Sure.
What's so costly about a new word, in the sense of why if one has a word for an older brother, or a separate word for a younger brother, or a separate word for my second youngest brother?
Sure.
What's the big deal? Why not just have? Why is it a principle to have something more simple? I can communicate brotherliness by any of those words, regardless of how old or young they are.
Right. I guess the notion is that, well, it's certainly true that you can get more and more specific about exactly which individual you have in mind. Going back to the example of the maternal grandmother, right? I'm trying to refer to her, and I just say my grandmother, and that leaves you with this sort of residual uncertainty as to who I'm talking about. So once you get more words in place, you can start making, you can dissolve that uncertainty. As to the question of why simplicity should be a principle at all, it actually winds up being pretty important, not just here, but as a very, very general principle, explaining, for example, some aspects of language acquisition, some aspects of visual perception. And so a very general notion that I personally find appealing is that our minds are constructed so as to seek simplicity. You can think of it as mental laziness, if you like. We don't want to clutter up our minds with extraneous stuff that's not going to do us that much good, or at least not as much good as we need. But there's a fair amount of evidence for this notion that our minds seek simplicity and find simplicity rewarding. That's the sort of, that's one way of putting it. Another way, which I don't dismiss entirely, is this notion of laziness and forgetfulness and so on. And so we want stuff that'll stick around. Hope that addresses it. Sure.
In terms of
I have 1 minute, is that right?
From an evolutionary point of view, the easier things are to communicate, I suppose, the better reproductive success you have as a group of people.
Well, you're speaking about the kinship stuff?
Yeah, just communication in general. The more important an idea is, the more people you use, you have to get across.
Right. I mean, certainly you would want to have highly informative communication about highly consequential things you talk about, for sure.
Research in terms of slang and the production of like acronyms to support your theory of informative communication?
So you have in mind that people will come up with non-simple but highly informative stuff for very consequential items. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that certainly does fit. So I should probably... Yeah? Okay. Well, thank you all very much. It's been my pleasure. And again, thanks to CSSA.